The autumn afternoon light filtered through the windows of Westfield Middle School as 14-year-old Daniel Morgan carefully placed his worn blue leather journal into his backpack alongside his science textbook and math homework. It was Wednesday, October 8, 2008, and Daniel had just finished another entry in the journal that had become his most treasured possession, a daily ritual that he had maintained faithfully for over 2 years. The journal, a gift from his grandmother on his 12th birthday, contained his thoughts, observations, poetry, and the detailed chronicles of a thoughtful teenager navigating the complex world of adolescence. Daniel's English teacher, Mrs. Patricia Henderson, had encouraged his writing throughout the semester, recognizing in him a natural storyteller with an unusually mature perspective for someone his age. She often commented on the depth of his creative writing assignments and had suggested that he consider submitting some of his work to the school's literary magazine. Daniel was shy about sharing his writing with others, but the daily practice of journaling had become essential to his sense of identity and purpose. The blue journal was a constant companion that Daniel carried everywhere, filling its pages with detailed accounts of his daily experiences, his dreams for the future, and his honest reflections on the challenges of being a sensitive, introspective teenager in a small Indiana town. He wrote about his love of reading science fiction novels, his struggles with algebra, his complicated feelings about his parents, recent divorce, and his observations about the natural world that he explored during long walks through the woods behind his house. Daniel lived with his mother, Susan Morgan, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Westfield, approximately 15 miles from the larger city of Indianapolis. Susan worked as a nurse at the local hospital, often pulling double shifts to make ends meet as a newly single mother. The divorce from Daniel's father had been difficult for both mother and son, but they had developed a close relationship built on honest communication and mutual respect for each other's independence. The apartment was small but comfortable, with Daniel's bedroom serving as both sleeping space and creative sanctuary, where he spent hours reading, writing in his journal, and working on the elaborate fantasy stories that he hoped someday to turn into published novels. His walls were covered with maps of imaginary worlds that he had drawn himself, along with quotes from his favorite authors and scientists that inspired his own writing and thinking. After school on October 8th, Daniel followed his usual routine of walking to the Westfield Public Library, where he spent most afternoons completing homework and browsing through the science fiction and fantasy sections that had become his favorite literary territories. The library was located approximately 6 blocks from his school, a pleasant walk through residential neighborhoods that Daniel had been making independently for over a year. Librarian Margaret Walsh knew Daniel well and often recommended new books that she thought would interest him. Daniel was one of her most dedicated patrons, checking out multiple books each week and participating in the teen discussion group that met monthly to talk about literature and writing. Mrs. Walsh appreciated Daniel's thoughtful questions and his ability to analyze complex themes in the books they discussed. On this particular afternoon, Daniel spent approximately 2 hours at the library, working on his homework at one of the study tables near the windows that overlooked the small park adjacent to the building. He made his usual entry in his blue journal, writing about his thoughts on the Isaac Asimov novel he was currently reading, and describing his ideas for a story he was planning about time travel and parallel universes. Around 4:30 p.m., Daniel packed his backpack and said goodbye to Mrs. Walsh, mentioning that he planned to stop by the used bookstore on Main Street before heading home. The bookstore, called Second Chapter, was owned by elderly Mr. Frank Coleman, who had become something of a mentor to Daniel over the past year. Mr. Coleman appreciated the teenager's literary interests and often saved interesting books that he thought Daniel might enjoy. Daniel arrived at Second Chapter at approximately 4:45 p.m., spending about 20 minutes browsing through the science fiction section and discussing with Mr. Coleman a new shipment of vintage paperbacks that had arrived that morning. Daniel selected a Ray Bradbury collection that he hadn't read before, paying for it with money he had earned from his weekend job helping a neighbor with yard work. Mr. Coleman later told investigators that Daniel had seemed completely normal during their conversation, enthusiastic about the book he was purchasing, and excited about a writing project he was working on for his English class. Daniel mentioned that he was planning to walk home through the woods behind the elementary school, a route he often took because it was shorter than the main roads and provided inspiration for his nature-themed writing. Daniel left Second Chapter at approximately 5:10 p.m., with enough daylight remaining for his usual walk home through the wooded area that connected the commercial district to his residential neighborhood. The path through the woods was well-worn and generally considered safe, used regularly by joggers, dog walkers, and local residents as a shortcut between different sections of town. However, Daniel Morgan never arrived home that evening. When 6:30 p.m. came and went without any sign of her son, Susan Morgan began to feel the first stirrings of concern. Daniel was typically punctual about dinner time, and always called if he was going to be late for any reason. His absence was particularly unusual because they had planned to watch a science fiction movie together that evening, something Daniel had been looking forward to all week. Susan tried calling Daniel's cell phone, but the calls went directly to voicemail. She then called the library and the bookstore to see if Daniel had lingered longer than usual, but both Mrs. Walsh and Mr. Coleman confirmed that he had left at his normal time. By 7 o'clock, Susan's concern had escalated to genuine worry, and she decided to drive along the route that Daniel would have taken home from downtown. The search of Daniel's usual route revealed no sign of him, though Susan did find his backpack abandoned beside the wooded path, approximately halfway between town and their apartment complex. The backpack contained Daniel's homework, his newly purchased book, and his school supplies, but notably missing was his blue journal, which Daniel never went anywhere without. Susan immediately contacted the Westfield Police Department to report her son missing and to explain the discovery of his abandoned backpack. Officer James Rodriguez was the first to respond, arriving at the scene at 7:45 p.m. to begin a preliminary investigation. Rodriguez was familiar with the Morgan family through his community policing work and knew Daniel as a responsible, trustworthy teenager who had never caused any trouble. The discovery of the backpack suggested that Daniel had encountered some kind of problem during his walk home, though there were no obvious signs of struggle or violence in the immediate area. Officer Rodriguez secured the scene and called for additional resources, including K-9 units that could track Daniel's scent and help determine which direction he might have gone from the location where his backpack was found. The search for Daniel began immediately and continued throughout the night of October 8th and into the following day. Volunteers from the community joined professional search and rescue teams to cover the wooded areas, while others checked abandoned buildings, creek beds, and any location where a teenager might have sought shelter or become trapped. The bloodhounds were able to track Daniel's scent from the backpack location for approximately 300 yards before the trail disappeared entirely near a gravel access road that provided service access to the wooded area. The abrupt end of the scent trail suggested that Daniel might have been picked up by a vehicle, either voluntarily or by force. Detective Carol Walsh of the Westfield Police Department took over the investigation on October 10th. Bringing specialized experience in missing persons cases to what was now being treated as a potential abduction. Detective Walsh was no relation to the librarian Margaret Walsh, though the coincidence of names would later create some confusion during the media coverage of Daniel's disappearance. Detective Walsh's initial interviews with Daniel's family, friends, and teachers revealed a picture of a well-adjusted teenager who was thriving academically and had no obvious problems that might motivate him to run away. Daniel was described as mature, responsible, and deeply committed to his writing and reading. He had a small circle of close friends but was generally considered quiet and studious, rather than social or rebellious. The investigation expanded to include anyone who had regular contact with Daniel or who might have observed his routines and habits. This included library staff, bookstore employees, teachers, and neighbors who might have noticed unusual activity in the area around the time of his disappearance. One interview provided a potentially significant lead. Maria Santos, who lived near the wooded path that Daniel used for his walks home, reported seeing an unfamiliar pickup truck parked near the access road on the evening of October 8th. According to Santos, the truck was dark-colored, possibly blue or black, and appeared to be an older model with damage to the front bumper. She had noticed it because vehicles rarely used that particular access road, and the driver seemed to be waiting for something rather than conducting maintenance or service work. The description of the suspicious truck was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout Indiana and neighboring states, and investigators began reviewing records of vehicle registrations and any crimes involving similar vehicles. However, the description was too general to narrow down specific suspects, and no one else reported seeing the truck or its driver. Detective Walsh also investigated the possibility that Daniel's disappearance might be connected to his writing activities or to someone who had taken an unhealthy interest in his journal entries. She interviewed his English teacher extensively about whether Daniel had ever mentioned feeling threatened or uncomfortable about anyone showing interest in his writing. Mrs. Henderson revealed that Daniel had mentioned receiving some anonymous notes in his school locker over the past month, messages that praised his writing ability and expressed interest in reading more of his work. Daniel had been flattered by the attention initially, but had become uncomfortable when the notes became more personal and asked specific questions about his daily routines and activities. This information prompted Detective Walsh to examine Daniel's locker and to interview school staff about anyone who might have had access to student lockers or who had shown unusual interest in particular students. The investigation revealed that the school's security was relatively lax, with multiple people having access to master keys and limited monitoring of who entered the building during non-school hours. As weeks passed without any trace of Daniel, the investigation began to focus on the possibility that he had been targeted by someone who had been observing his routines and had specifically chosen to intercept him during his walk home through the woods. The anonymous note suggested that someone had been paying close attention to Daniel's activities and had been planning some kind of contact or approach. The case attracted regional media attention, with Daniel's photograph appearing on television news programs and in newspapers throughout the Midwest. The coverage emphasized his passion for writing and the significance of his missing blue journal, generating hundreds of tips from people who thought they might have seen Daniel or who had information about suspicious individuals in the area. However, none of the tips led to credible evidence about Daniel's whereabouts, and as months passed, the active investigation gradually scaled back to periodic reviews of new information and tips. Daniel's mother maintained hope that her son might still be alive somewhere, possibly being held against his will or suffering from amnesia that prevented him from returning home. Susan Morgan became an advocate for missing children, working with organizations that supported families of missing persons and lobbying for improved security measures in schools and public areas. She established a reward fund for information about Daniel's disappearance and continued to coordinate media coverage that kept his story in the public consciousness. The first anniversary of Daniel's disappearance brought renewed attention to the case, but also the painful reality that a 14-year-old boy was unlikely to survive for extended periods if he had been abducted by someone with malicious intentions. However, the complete absence of physical evidence or credible witnesses meant that Daniel's fate remained a mystery that continued to haunt his family and community. Years passed with no significant developments in Daniel's case. He would have graduated from high school in 2012 and would have been starting college during the time when his case began to be classified as a cold case that was reviewed periodically but had no active leads to pursue. The breakthrough in Daniel's case came in July 2019, 11 years after his disappearance. Robert and Linda Patterson, a retired couple from Fort Wayne, Indiana, had recently purchased a 1950s farmhouse that they planned to renovate as their retirement home. The house had been vacant for several years and required extensive work to make it habitable for modern living. While cleaning out the attic space to prepare for installation, Robert Patterson discovered a collection of items that appeared to have been hidden deliberately behind loose floorboards in a remote corner of the attic. Among these items was a blue leather journal that showed signs of extensive use and contained hundreds of pages of handwritten entries. Robert initially assumed that the journal belonged to a previous owner of the house and might contain interesting historical information about the property. However, as he began reading the entries, he realized that the journal appeared to have been written by a teenager and contained references to contemporary events and technology that indicated it was much more recent than the age of the house would suggest. The journal entries were dated, with the most recent entry being October 8, 2008. The final entry described the author's excitement about a new book purchase and his plans for writing a science fiction story about time travel. More significantly, the journal contained the name Daniel Morgan written on the inside cover, along with contact information that included a Westfield address and phone number. Robert Patterson immediately contacted the Westfield Police Department to report his discovery, recognizing that the journal might be connected to a missing person case. Detective Jennifer Morrison, who had taken over responsibility for cold cases, arrived at the farmhouse within hours to examine the journal and the circumstances of its discovery. The blue journal was indeed confirmed to be Daniel Morgan's missing diary, containing over 2 years of daily entries that chronicled his thoughts, experiences, and observations right up until the day he disappeared. The discovery of the journal in the attic of a house located 40 miles from Westfield provided the first concrete evidence about Daniel's fate in 11 years. Detective Morrison immediately organized a comprehensive search of the farmhouse and surrounding property, using both metal detectors and cadaver dogs to look for any additional evidence that might be connected to Daniel's disappearance. The search revealed human remains buried beneath the basement floor of the house, remains that DNA analysis would later confirm belonged to Daniel Morgan. The discovery of Daniel's remains finally answered the question of his fate, while raising new questions about the circumstances of his death and the identity of his killer. The house had been owned since 2007 by Walter Briggs, a 62-year-old man who had died of natural causes in 2017, 2 years before the Pattersons purchased the property from his estate. Investigation into Walter Briggs revealed a troubling pattern of behavior that made him a compelling suspect in Daniel's murder. Briggs had been arrested several times for stalking and harassment, though he had never been convicted of violent crimes. More significantly, employment records showed that Briggs had worked as a substitute custodian for the Westfield School District, during the fall of 2008, giving him access to the building and potentially to student lockers. The investigation revealed that Briggs had apparently been the author of the anonymous notes that Daniel had received in his school locker, using his access as a substitute employee to monitor Daniel's activities and to leave messages that gradually escalated in their personal nature and invasiveness. Forensic examination of Daniel's remains and the burial site revealed evidence that was consistent with homicide, though the condition of the remains made it difficult to determine the exact cause of death. The careful burial beneath the basement floor suggested that Briggs had planned to conceal the crime permanently and had taken steps to ensure that Daniel's body would not be discovered. The investigation also revealed that Briggs had apparently approached Daniel during his walk home on October 8, 2008, possibly claiming to be a school employee who needed assistance or who had a message from Daniel's mother. Once Briggs had gained Daniel's trust and gotten him into his vehicle, he had taken the teenager to his farmhouse where he killed him and buried his body. The preservation of Daniel's journal in the attic suggested that Briggs had been fascinated by Daniel's writing and had kept the diary as a trophy or memento of his crime. The fact that Briggs had hidden the journal rather than destroying it indicated a psychological attachment to Daniel's thoughts and personality that went beyond the simple desire to conceal evidence. The resolution of Daniel's case provided closure for his mother and the Westfield community that had been haunted by his disappearance for over a decade. However, the knowledge that Daniel had been murdered by someone who had been systematically stalking him made the tragedy even more difficult to accept. Susan Morgan finally had answers about her son's fate, but she also had to confront the reality that Daniel had been targeted and killed by a predator who had exploited his access to the school system to identify and pursue a vulnerable teenager. The fact that Briggs had died before being held accountable for his crime added another layer of frustration to an already devastating situation. The discovery of Daniel's journal led to changes in how school districts screen and monitor substitute employees, particularly those who have access to student areas and information. Background checks were enhanced, and supervision protocols were strengthened to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in other communities. Daniel's case also contributed to advances in cold case investigation techniques, particularly regarding the importance of thoroughly searching properties associated with suspects even years after crimes have been committed. The discovery of evidence in Walter Briggs's farmhouse demonstrated how perpetrators might conceal crimes for extended periods until property transfers or renovations reveal hidden evidence. The Westfield Public Library established a memorial reading room in Daniel's honor, featuring a collection of science fiction and fantasy books that reflected his literary interests. The room includes a plaque describing Daniel's passion for writing and his dreams of becoming a published author, serving as inspiration for other young writers while keeping his memory alive. Mrs. Henderson, Daniel's English teacher, established a creative writing scholarship in his name, providing financial assistance to high school students who demonstrated exceptional talent and dedication to writing. The scholarship has helped dozens of young writers pursue their educational goals while honoring the memory of a student whose own writing career was cut short by violence. The blue journal that had been Daniel's constant companion and creative outlet was preserved as evidence throughout the investigation and legal proceedings. The journal's final entry, written on the day of Daniel's disappearance, described his excitement about a new book and his plans for future writing projects, serving as a poignant reminder of the potential that was lost when his life was ended by a predator's violence. Today, the farmhouse where Daniel's remains were discovered has been renovated by the Patterson family, who have worked to transform a place of tragedy into a peaceful home. They maintain a small garden in Daniel's memory and have donated copies of his favorite books to local libraries, ensuring that his love of literature continues to inspire others. The case of Daniel Morgan serves as a reminder of how predators can exploit positions of trust and access to target vulnerable young people, and how the pursuit of creative expression can sometimes make children visible to those who would harm them. His story continues to be studied by law enforcement professionals and used in training programs for school security personnel. The daily writing practice that had brought Daniel so much joy and had been intended to preserve his thoughts and experiences for the future instead became the evidence that finally solved the mystery of his disappearance. His journal entries provided investigators with insights into his personality and activities that helped them understand how he had been targeted and pursued by his killer. The woods where Daniel loved to walk and find inspiration for his writing continue to be used by residents of Westfield, though a small memorial marker now reminds visitors of the young writer who disappeared there in 2008. The marker includes a quote from one of Daniel's journal entries about the importance of observing and recording the beauty of the natural world, ensuring that his voice continues to speak to those who share his love of both nature and literature.